making the transition to data integrator from Spectre. But really what I want to talk about is, are you getting the most out of the Spectre cBase engine? And I know many of you are using builds and you're using that technology to help you create your cBases, but there's probably some more features that you haven't used or haven't thought to use. So we want to talk about those. What we're going to cover is data types, which is an integral part of Spectre. Spectre inputs, some transformation capabilities, and Spectre outputs. So Spectre has currently 8 data types. String, integer, double, fixed 100. We don't need to go into each one of them, but it's important that you understand that as data is coming in, we want to assign a data type to every column. And the reason for that is efficiency. We want the Spectre to work effectively. There's a lot of tools that I can use downstream. If something is identified as a date, the date can then roll up to something else. There's a lot of functions that I can use, and those are all going to depend on what the data might be. And when we talk about inputs, right now there's 4 ways you could think of getting data into Spectre. You could start off with a text file, and many of you have probably done that. There's ODBC, which allows me to connect directly to a database. And something very interesting about that is if you're connecting to a database, it's probably a relational database, and in that, all the data is typed. So it is a number or a string or something else. And as I'm moving that through Spectre, it keeps that. I don't have to go through the extra process of going in and then typing that particular information. And another thing that you could bring in would be another cBase. And I saw this in Kobe's presentation yesterday. What he does is the measure factory runs, I think specifically for hospital ops, and he goes in and he says, okay, I want the accounts data set that's coming out of that, and he uses it as an input for his cBases that he creates. So then as he comes in, he does some filters and he makes some changes. And something for 7.2 is the ability locally to take an MS Excel file, a Microsoft Excel file, or more specifically an XLSX file, and bring that into Spectre. So, Scott? Locally? Meaning that it's a file that you put on the server or somewhere on the network that your Spectre engine has access to. Yep. And I'm going to do an example of that.
Yeah, so our demos today, we have 4 demos, text files, ODBC. We're going to run through these as demos. So, okay, our text input, the text file, let's just get the text file going here. It's under data, and it is the tiny, tiny little font, data types. Okay, so this file, I built this file using DataGen, okay? It's good for creating sample data, which this is. But the point is, it has every data type that we have. So we have string, we have double, we have fixed 100. They're all in date time, date, and period. So let's go back, and I'm gonna run the program. It's very fast because it's just a small file. And ProDiver will come up. Certain data types automatically become dimensions. So the Boolean, date, date time, string, year, and year month are period. They automatically default to becoming dimensions. And if we just dive on something, anything that is double, fixed 100, or integer automatically becomes a summary column. So let's go back to the slides.
All right, thanks. So again, that was a simple text file. Now let's look at an ODBC example, or a SQL example. So let me just clean up the screen here a little bit. Close that up, and all right, so in this example, what I want to do is connect to an existing database. And in fact, I'm connected to our cloud network right now. And on that cloud network, I have a database that, and this one is called Sales, actually, that I'm able to connect to the products. That's what it says. It says select star from products.
and I'm just gonna go ahead and test it. So what happens is it goes out, it connects to that database, it grabs the feeds, it creates the columns, right? I can do other things like alias them, because essentially they were database names and they're not necessarily what I want my end users to see. So I'm going to change all the names, and some of them I might drop. So when I test this, I just go ahead and test it with a dive, and sure enough, again, it's going back out on the cloud, it's going to the database, it's grabbing all those fields and bringing them in. Perfect. But the point was, is this keeping the types? Because as you see in here, I'm not specifying that this is a string or this is a number or a double or whatever. So how do I know if this is actually working? Well, one thing is, let's go ahead and run it. And so I'm going to run that script. Again, it went out to the database, grabbed it, did an alias, and then created the cBase, and here's the cBase. But here in ProDiver, I don't actually see anything that's going to tell me whether or not this is a string or a number or a date. I can make some guesses, but I don't know. And one of the best ways to do that is here in Workbench. So under my cBases, I have this cBase I just created called sales, and if I double click on it, I get the cBase overview. And a lot of you might have seen this before and go, well, it doesn't look that interesting because there's just a button here to choose Open ProDiver. But there's actually a lot of information, especially if I choose Info. And now I can see that invoice number, invoice row, those are all strings. Ship date is a date. Ship year is a string. I'd probably want to change that to a period. But ship month, it did identify that. And again, this is the information that I was getting from the database. The database probably for the year was stored as a string, and that's the way that it's being passed along.
So now we have a very, very short demo about cBases. Okay, so we're taking cBase input, and we're going to be filtering it. Now, Dan said he doesn't want to filter, but in case you do want to filter, it's going to be really, really fast because we're connecting to the DiveLine server, and it doesn't even pull the data that it doesn't need. It only pulls the records that it needs. So if we did a demo, we did a demo earlier, even with the small amount of data we have, it takes slightly longer to pull everything, and if we filter, it's much, much quicker.
All right, so Microsoft Excel. So this is brand new, available in 7.2. So for this one, I'm just going to create the demo. I'm going to walk through the whole process. So what I want to do is I want to create a new program. More specifically, what I want to do is create a Spectre build file. And we'll just call this Excel Example. Looks like I already have one, so example 1, that's fine. So this is what the Spectre UI interface does. It goes ahead and says, okay, well, you're going to start off with the text input, and you're going to end up with the cBase. Well, in this case, I actually want an Excel file. So I do have an Excel file. Over here, if I look at it, it's a file as you would expect. It's just some basic information. Here's the countries in 2022. Here's the population. 2021 was the population. And so what is the growth rate? That's exactly what I see here in this Excel document. So I also have it in my data. So you can see, hopefully you can see that. Let's try the zoom. Yeah. Right there. So I have countries.xlsx. Get out of that. And this is a text file. What I want is an Excel input. I'm going to right click on that object or node and choose Convert Object to Excel. So I'll choose Excel. And then what I need to do is give it a path. So the Excel file path, it's in my data folder. Data. And there's the countries.xlsx. I'll choose select. And it doesn't look like it kind of worked. Maybe it worked. If I right click on it and I choose test node or test the dive, actually it did. It was able to go out and grab some of the information. The reason why it didn't pull out everything is because in this case there's a workbook and there's actually at least 2 worksheets. Well, I see 2 worksheets or sheets. So I'm going to go back into this and be a little bit more specific. So here's the file, and then it says, there it is. Yeah, it is. It's like an odd angle. Okay, so here's the sheet. I'm going to type in population. Okay. And that's it. And as soon as I do that, notice it's now found those columns. So there are the columns that's coming from that sheet in this particular workbook. And if I do a test, I'm now able to test the dive. So wonderful. I think this is great. I'll be able to take Excel documents, put them onto my server, and just move them in without doing any additional processing. But what if your spreadsheet doesn't look like this? Maybe it looks something like this, right? Oh, I'm sorry. Question? Was Joe? Yeah. Yes, it can support a named range. I'm going to do something similar, but I didn't want to get into all of that in the short presentation, but you'll see, I'll show you that when I switch back over. But here's something where, you know, it's got a chart in it, and it's highly formatted, and just to clarify, it's only the top 10. It isn't a giant list, but this is what I want to go to next. So how do I do that? Well, I'll come back to Excel, and it's a different sheet name, right? So down here it says sheet. This time it's going to be population top 10. And the other problem with this is that the data doesn't really start until row 16. So what I'm going to do is say that my start row is 16. And here again, it's able to find those columns. But specifically, Joe, your question was named ranges or ranges. As you can see right here, or maybe you can't. Let me zoom in and get out of that. There is a range, okay? Which I hadn't created a name range in this example. But let's go back.
Does that necessarily need to be a named range, or could it be A1?
It could be A1, yeah, and which would be the same, yeah, a named range or a range, right? So then I'll go ahead and I'll test it. I'll test the node, and sure enough, that's what I get. The top 10 countries by their populations for, as we saw in the Excel worksheet, okay? Yes? I haven't tested it enough. I don't know, and of course it depends on how Excel sorted it, right? So it stored it, not sorted, stored it. If it was stored as a number, it should come over as a number. If it was stored as a string, I'm not really sure. All right, I just realized I didn't repeat the question as I should have, and that would have helped here. The question is if there's leading zeros in the Excel, in the column, what happens? And my basic response was, if Excel sees it as a number, it should come over as a number. If it sees it as a string, I suspect it would be a string and it would probably truncate. Okay. The answer was it'll parse it using the Spectre parse engine. So, okay, excellent.
Okay, so we're done with the data input portion. Let's go on to the calculations. Oh, yes.
The Excel file, what if you get files that sometimes have a header and sometimes don't have a header?
Well, in there is a section that, yes, thank you. Yes, sir. So the question was, sometimes the file has a header and sometimes it doesn't have a header. Well, you're going to have to figure out some sort of a pre-process for that. If you notice in there, or when you get it, there's a section in there that states, does this Excel have headers? Yeah, and it's a true or false option. But if it's random like that, well, I would use some sort of a pre-process, probably, do some sort of check, throw it away, and then use my own fixed header and process it.
Okay, so as I said, we were finished with the input. We're moving on to calculations, and we can see there are 240 different calculations. Now, it won't take long. We'll go through all of them one by one. Okay, no, we won't. Let's go back and calculations, yep. Okay, so here's our calc node. Yeah, here's the calc node. And let's just have a look at one simple little calculation. Let me make it bigger so we can see it. Okay, now, we just want to have a bit more information. There are 2 parameters, okay? And if we click here, down in this section, it'll tell us the name of the function, tell us what the data type for the parameter is, because we like data types. And we have a new feature, context-sensitive help. So simply click here, and it will bring up our context-sensitive help. And that is brand new as of 7.1, I believe.
7.126, but it's on the last slide.
There we go. So,
yeah. So context-sensitive help, that is now for all Spectre functions, and we plan on adding more when we get them to work, I guess. All right, so data transformation. We're not going to go through all of them, but here's 2 that I hear this quite often. I say, well, why don't you do a rotate? And they say, you could do rotate in Spectre? Yeah, you can do a rotate in Spectre. Here's an example. Now, if you're not familiar with a rotate, I'm going to try to keep it short. But here's the way I usually explain a rotate, is I have this text file, and review here. All right, so I have this text file, and I have the salesperson, and I have the various years. One way to explain this is I have 1 dimension, and I have 5 summary columns. Right? 1 dimension and 5 summary columns. However, these 5 summary columns are really goals. They're all really the same thing. So what I would like to do is reduce the number of summary columns. That's the way I go about thinking about a rotate. So in this case, here's a rotate in Spectre, and I'm going to describe it. What I'm going to say is I now need a new dimension. So I'll have the original dimension, salesperson, and a new dimension called year. But I'm going to rotate all of those goals into a single summary column. And there's a couple of ways to do that. In this case, I said auto rotate, which is essentially a range from 2018 to 2022. And so what I'm going to do is just test this, and you'll see, here's the output. I now have 2 dimensions and 1 summary, the year, the goal, and the salesperson. Okay? So yes, you can rotate in Spectre.
okay, so the next one we want to talk about was squash. Now, by show of hands, who knows what a squash is? Okay, almost everybody, not quite everybody. Okay, so we'll do a very quick little squash example. Okay, so obviously a text input. Now our data is commodity sales, so we have a number of sales for each commodity. The squash is, okay, the squash is simply going to take the commodity indicator, that's our dimension, it will squash on that dimension, and we'll sum all the other values. And that will look like this. And so we have 7 commodities, we have 7 rows that are the totals for all of the different sales.
Very good. So as you can see, there are other transformation capabilities that are available now in Spectre. All right. And now let's talk about the output. So so we know that in a build file, the build file has one function. What it does is it creates a cBase. But sometimes you're like, well, what I need is a text file. I don't need the cBase. So how do I get that into a text file if I started with a build script? Well, let's try to clean up. Okay. Well, one way to do that is with the die file. Okay. And some of you may not be familiar with the die file, but it's pretty straightforward here. I'm going to end up with 3 dimensions and 1 column. That's what I'm asking for, and it's going against the cBase called sales. Okay. Now, if I run it, what I used to have happen is I would then move my eyes to the bottom of the screen to the output. And inside the output, I would see what the output is. And then that's great, it's not a text file. But very recently, in 7.1.27, again, it'll be on the last slide as to what version it is, it now creates a new tab, a new tab in the workbench. So here, I actually have a text file. And it automatically saves it or stores it in the temp folder. It's called programs 8 sales.dive.txt. Well, that's not really what I want it to be because I do want this. So all I have to do is go to File, Save As, and I can say, okay, I want to put it in the data folder, and we'll just call it, to make it quick, sales. We'll just call it sales.txt. Right? And then done. Now I have a text file. Now some of you are saying, yes, that's awesome, that's exactly what I wanted, but what if you need this every day? It updates every day. I'm certainly not logging into Workbench every day and going to save that. So is there a way to automate that? Of course. What we would use is production. So here's a production script. Right? I have a start and then I have a dive. So this is one of the nodes in production, a dive. And what's unique about this, or what I'm specifically doing, is I'm saying go ahead and look at that very same dive file I was just looking at. Let's try to zoom again. Right? So 08 sales.dive, but here's an important step. I want the output to go to my temp directory and call it sales.txt. So we'll get out of there and just very quickly, we'll run it. That's it. Now, to prove that it worked, here's the sales.txt, and if I hover, again, I guess the front row would be able to verify it, at 2:49 today, it was created, and there is the very large sales.txt file, okay? And then finally,
So our last demo is using ODBC, which actually reaches into the Diveline server and pulls data to wherever you need it. So we're going to use Excel.
it's already open.
Yeah, I see that. I just got to click on it. And I got to find the mouse. There we go. Okay, so I will open up a brand new blank workbook. Okay, so blank workbook. Go to Data. Go to Get Data from other sources and pick an ODBC. Now, we have already set up an ODBC data source on the machine. It should list in just a second here. There we go. And the data source happens to be called sales because it connects to the sales cBase that we happen to have on our Diveline server. Okay, so just a tiny bit more setup work. We have to drill down a little bit from master to public and click on data, and we get a preview of the data that's there and simply say load. And, well, in a second, it'll pull the data over the internet and load 51,000 some odd records, and there they are.
Thanks. So yeah, this has all sorts of possibilities. Not only can this connect to Excel, but there's lots of other tools out there that use an ODBC connection that you can point this to point to the dive line and pull the data that you need. All right, so you're saying, well, I didn't know this stuff existed. Actually, it did. In 7.0, the original 7 data types were there. ODBC input, the ability to connect a .build file to a database, was originally there. We had the ability to filter the cBase at 7.0. In 7.1, we added rotate and DIUC22, what Scot just showed. In 7.11, we added an 8th data type, which is called date time. And then 7.1.22 was squash. Context-sensitive help with that was added really recently. It was 7.1.25. I was a little off. And then dive results was added in 7.1.26. And now in 7.2, you have the ability to have an Excel input for a Spectre build file. Yeah. And finally, a lot of this information, the things that we brought together here, all came from existing Knowledge Forum presentations. And if you're not familiar with the Knowledge Forums, go here, demins.com/KF. We have all the recordings. We're up to some crazy number. Yeah, it's a very, very large number of pre-recorded presentations. Otherwise, please feel free to reach out to either myself, Garvey, or Scott, and we can answer some questions about this, or if you have a suggestion for the Knowledge Forum. Scott isn't always on the screen, but he's actually in charge of the Knowledge Forum. He reviews all the material, and they're very good.